The marble floors of the Rivera mansion echoed with Santiago's laughter as his father built another tower of golden blocks. At 2 years old, the boy had never asked where Mommy was. The contract marriage had worked perfectly. Alejandro watched his son's innocent joy, their peaceful post-divorce life undisturbed. Then came the knock. The woman stood trembling in the rain at his doorstep, clutching a silver locket against her chest. Her familiar eyes, too familiar, darted past him to the child playing inside. "What brings you here?" Alejandro asked, his voice carefully neutral. She took a shaky breath, tears mixing with raindrops on her cheeks. "I didn't want to come, but I'm sorry. Just forgive me for what I'm about to tell you." What truth did he not know that required his ex-wife's sister to confess? Were they planning to cling to his life again? Alejandro Rivera had spent his entire adult life building walls. At 34, he had constructed an empire worth $3.7 billion, a reputation that commanded respect in boardrooms from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, and most importantly, an impenetrable fortress around his private life. The contract marriage with Isabella had been the final brick in that wall, a carefully orchestrated arrangement that gave him a son, satisfied societal expectations, and kept his true nature safely hidden from a world that still wasn't ready to accept a gay billionaire at the helm of a conservative tech empire. The penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side reflected this same philosophy of controlled perfection. Everything was pristine, expensive, and deliberately impersonal, except for one corner of the living room where Santiago's toys created a splash of color against the sterile backdrop. It was the only space where Alejandro allowed chaos, the only place where his carefully maintained facade could crack and reveal the devoted father beneath the ruthless businessman. Now, as he sat cross-legged on the Italian marble floor building block towers with his son, Alejandro marveled at how perfectly their arrangement had worked. The divorce papers had been signed exactly 2 months ago, with Isabella taking her generous settlement and disappearing to her new life in Monaco. She had played her part flawlessly, the devoted wife who simply grew apart from her workaholic husband. The media bought it, his board of directors were satisfied with his stable family image, and most importantly, no one questioned why Alejandro Rivera never seemed interested in dating women. Santiago clapped his hands as another block tower wobbled precariously. "Más alto, papa! Higher?" Alejandro raised an eyebrow, his heart swelling with the pure joy that only his son could bring. "You want it to fall down?" "Sí! Boom!" Santiago giggled, his dark eyes sparkling with mischief. These moments were what made every sacrifice worthwhile. The years of pretending to be someone he wasn't, the carefully choreographed public appearances with Isabella, the constant fear that someone would discover his secret, all of it faded away when Santiago looked at him with such unconditional love and trust. The sharp knock at the door shattered his contentment like a hammer through glass. Alejandro's blood ran cold. His security team downstairs had strict instructions: no unannounced visitors. Ever. His private elevator required a special key card that only a handful of people possessed, and none of them would show up without calling first. Santiago looked up from his blocks, his little face scrunching with curiosity. "¿Quién es, papá?" "Stay here, mijo," Alejandro said softly, his protective instincts flaring. He moved to the security panel beside the door, checking the camera feed from the hallway. What he saw made his stomach drop to his feet. A woman with rain-soaked dark hair stood outside his door, her shoulders shaking with either cold or emotion. She looked up at the camera as if she knew he was watching, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. Catalina. Isabella's younger sister. He had met her only once, at his wedding to Isabella 3 years ago. She had been a ghost at the periphery of that elaborate charade, quiet and almost invisible among the society guests and paparazzi. But her eyes, those same dark eyes now staring into his security camera, had held a sadness that had haunted him for weeks afterward. Isabella had mentioned her sister worked as a pediatric nurse, struggling with some unnamed personal issues, but the details had been carefully vague, and Alejandro hadn't pressed for more information. "Papa!" Santiago's voice pulled him back to the present. His son had abandoned his blocks and was now standing beside him, tiny hands pressed against the door. "¿Por qué estás asustado?" "Afraid?" Alejandro forced his expression into something resembling calm. His son was already too perceptive for his own good. "I'm not afraid, mijo. Just surprised." He opened the door slowly, keeping his body positioned to shield Santiago from view. Catalina stood there in a simple navy coat that had seen better days, her hair plastered to her head from the October rain. But it was the silver locket clutched against her chest that caught his attention. Old, tarnished, and held with the desperation of someone clinging to their last hope. "Catalina," he said, his voice coming out more formal than he intended. "This is unexpected." She looked past him, her gaze finding Santiago, who was peeking around his father's legs with the fearless curiosity of a toddler. The moment her eyes met the little boy's, something fundamental shifted in her expression. Pain, longing, recognition, and something else that made Alejandro's chest tighten with unease. "I know," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming against the windows. "I promised myself I would never come here. I swore I could live with what we did. But I can't. God help me, I can't keep pretending anymore." Before Alejandro could respond, Santiago squeezed past his legs and looked up at Catalina with the open warmth that children possess before the world teaches them to be afraid. "Estás bien?" he asked in the careful Spanish that Alejandro had been teaching him. "You look sad." Catalina's composure crumbled like paper in rain. She dropped to her knees on the wet marble threshold, bringing herself to Santiago's eye level, and Alejandro watched in shock as his son stepped forward without hesitation. "Hola, mi pequeño," she breathed, her voice thick with an emotion that Alejandro couldn't name. I'm your tia Catalina." "Tia?" Santiago tilted his head, processing the word with the serious concentration he brought to all new concepts. Then, to Alejandro's complete bewilderment, his son reached out and touched Catalina's wet cheek with the gentle curiosity of someone recognizing something familiar. "¿Por qué lloras?" "Because I've missed you so much," Catalina whispered, and the raw honesty in her voice made Alejandro's blood run cold. "Santiago, come inside," Alejandro said sharply, his protective instincts screaming danger. "You're getting wet." But Santiago didn't move. Instead, he studied Catalina's face with an intensity that shouldn't exist in a 2-year-old meeting a stranger. There was recognition there, impossible and unsettling, as if some deep part of him remembered something his conscious mind couldn't grasp. Catalina seemed to understand what she was seeing, because her tears came harder now. With trembling fingers, she opened the locket around her neck, revealing a tiny photograph inside. Alejandro couldn't see the image from his angle, but Santiago's face lit up with pure delight. "Bebé!" exclaimed, clapping his hands together. "Es Bebé Santiago?" The words hit Alejandro like ice water. He stepped forward, his businessman's instinct screaming that he was walking into a trap. "What is that picture?" Catalina stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She held the locket toward him, and Alejandro saw what had made Santiago so excited. It was a hospital photograph of a newborn baby, but not just any baby. It was clearly a professional hospital shot, complete with the tiny ID bracelet and sterile hospital blanket that Alejandro remembered from Santiago's birth. "This was taken 4 hours after he was born," Catalina said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Before they cleaned him up for you, before they put him in Isabella's arms for the photographers, before they told you he was biologically hers." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. What the hell are you talking about? Isabella couldn't get pregnant. Catalina said, each word falling like stones into still water. The endometriosis had destroyed too much tissue. But your contract required a biological child, didn't it? The lawyers were very specific about genetic parentage. Alejandro's mind raced back to the negotiations, to the endless legal documents his attorneys had drafted and redrafted. Yes, the contract had been specific about biological parentage. It had been insurance, protection against future custody battles, or inheritance disputes. His lawyers had insisted on genetic testing to ensure the child would be legally and indisputably his. So what exactly are you saying? But even as he asked, a terrible understanding was beginning to dawn. They used my egg, Catalina said simply. Isabella carried him, but genetically. She looked at Santiago, who had wandered back to his blocks but was still glancing over at them with curious eyes. Genetically, he's mine. The words hit Alejandro like a physical blow. He reached out to steady himself against the doorframe, his mind reeling through implications he wasn't ready to face. The fertility treatments that Isabella had insisted on handling privately, her strange detachment during the pregnancy, as if she were performing a job rather than carrying her own child. The way Santiago looked nothing like Isabella, but had features that Alejandro couldn't quite place. Until now. That's impossible, he said, but his voice lacked any conviction. Catalina reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a thick manila envelope, its contents heavy with the weight of truth. I have all the medical records, she said quietly. From the fertility clinic, the genetic tests, the consent forms I signed. Her voice cracked. I have everything, Alejandro, every piece of evidence you need to verify what I'm telling you. Alejandro stared at the envelope as if it contained explosives, because in a way, it did. If what Catalina was saying was true, it would detonate everything he thought he knew about his son, his marriage, his carefully constructed life. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper. Why would you agree to that? Why would Isabella? Because she was desperate, Catalina interrupted, fresh tears streaming down her face. The contract would have set her up for life, made her one of the wealthiest women in the country, but only if she could give you what you needed, a biological heir. She paused, looking at Santiago with such naked longing that Alejandro felt his heart constrict. And I was 26 and stupid, and thought I was saving my sister's life. Saving her life? Our family was drowning in debt, Catalina said, her voice hollow with old grief. Medical bills from our mother's cancer treatment. Our father had lost everything in the housing crisis. Isabella was facing bankruptcy, and I was young enough to believe that helping her would somehow fix everything wrong with our family. Alejandro closed his eyes, pieces of a puzzle he hadn't known existed clicking into place. Isabella's sudden financial stability before their marriage, her family's mysterious disappearance from debt collectors who had been hounding them for years, the way Isabella had never seemed to bond with Santiago, treating him more like a cherished obligation than her own flesh and blood. And now? He asked, though he dreaded the answer. Now I can't have children of my own, Catalina whispered, her words carrying the weight of dreams that would never be fulfilled. I was diagnosed with ovarian cancer 8 months ago. Stage 3. The chemotherapy and radiation. They've destroyed any chance I might have had for my own family. The silence stretched between them, broken only by Santiago's happy chatter as he stacked his blocks, completely oblivious to the conversation that was reshaping his entire world. Alejandro felt as if he were drowning, each revelation pulling him deeper into waters he didn't know how to navigate. The doctors say I have 6 months, Catalina continued, her voice growing stronger even as she delivered devastating news. Maybe 8 if I'm lucky, and the experimental treatments work, but probably not longer than that. What do you want from me? Alejandro asked, though he was terrified of the answer. Catalina looked directly at him, her dark eyes blazing with a fierce, desperate love that took his breath away. I want to know my son, she said simply. I'm not asking to take him away from you. I can see how much you love him, and he's happy here. He belongs with you. Her voice broke slightly. But he's the only child I will ever have, and I gave him away before I understood what that meant. I want to spend whatever time I have left being part of his life, even if it's just as Tia Catalina. Alejandro's first instinct was to refuse, to protect the life he had built with Santiago from this devastating intrusion. But as he watched his son abandon his blocks and toddle over to where Catalina still knelt by the door, as he saw the natural, inexplicable comfort between them, he realized that the choice might not be entirely his to make. "Papa," Santiago said, tugging on Alejandro's sleeve with the serious expression he wore when something was bothering him. "Tia Catalina is cold and sad. Can she come inside?" And in that moment, looking into his son's innocent, caring eyes, Alejandro understood that Santiago's well-being had to come first, even if it meant opening his carefully controlled world to chaos, even if it meant facing truths that would change everything he thought he knew about love, family, and what it meant to be a father. "Come inside," he said quietly to Catalina. "We have a lot to talk about." As she stepped across the threshold, clutching her locket and her envelope of life-altering secrets, Alejandro couldn't shake the feeling that he was making either the biggest mistake of his life or the most important decision he would ever make. Possibly both. The first few days were a careful dance of boundaries and tentative trust. Alejandro had insisted on genetic testing to verify Catalina's claims, though deep down he already knew she was telling the truth. Santiago's immediate, inexplicable connection to her was evidence enough. While they waited for the results, Catalina had taken a leave of absence from her job at Mount Sinai Children's Hospital, and Alejandro had made the impulsive decision to ask her to stay as Santiago's nanny. "You don't have to pay me," she had said when he made the offer. "Just being near him is enough." But Alejandro insisted on proper compensation. It felt too much like charity otherwise, and he sensed that Catalina's pride was already fragile enough without adding financial dependence to her burden. The change in Santiago was immediate and remarkable. The little boy who had always been happy and well-adjusted suddenly blossomed into something even more vibrant. He followed Catalina everywhere, chattering in his mix of English and Spanish, showing her his toys, his books, his favorite hiding spots around the penthouse. She responded to his enthusiasm with a patience and joy that reminded Alejandro of why he had fallen in love with the idea of being a father in the first place. Watching them together was both beautiful and heartbreaking. There was an ease between them that defied explanation, as if some deep genetic memory was finally being fulfilled. Santiago would curl up in Catalina's lap while she read to him, his small body fitting against hers with the perfect trust of a child who has found his missing piece. She taught him songs in Spanish that she claimed their grandmother had sung to her and Isabella when they were children. She showed him how to make paper airplanes and how to whistle through his fingers and how to identify the different sounds that birds made outside their windows. "How do you know all this?" Alejandro asked one evening as they watched Santiago chase the paper airplane Catalina had just launched across the living room. "I've been a pediatric nurse for 8 years," she said simply. "You learn what makes children happy." But Alejandro sensed there was more to it than professional experience. There was an intuitive understanding between Catalina and Santiago that went beyond training or education. She seemed to anticipate his needs before he expressed them, to understand his moods and fears and joys with an accuracy that sometimes unsettled Alejandro in its intensity. The genetic test results came back on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by courier in a sealed envelope that felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Alejandro sat in his home office, staring at it for an hour, before he found the courage to break the seal. The scientific language was dense and clinical, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Catalina Moreno was confirmed to be the biological mother of Santiago Rivera, with 99.97% certainty. He found Catalina in Santiago's room, sitting in the rocking chair by the window while the little boy napped in his bed. The afternoon light caught the silver threads in her dark hair, threads that Alejandro realized weren't premature gray, but the aftermath of chemotherapy that was slowly stealing her life away. "The results came back," he said quietly. She nodded without looking at him. "I know what they say. Why didn't you ever try to contact him before now, before you got sick?" Catalina was quiet for so long that Alejandro thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I thought I was doing the right thing," she said. "I thought giving him to you and Isabella meant he would have everything I could never provide. Stability, security, opportunities I couldn't dream of offering." She turned to look at Santiago's sleeping form, her expression tender and heartbroken. "I told myself that loving him meant letting him go completely. And now I know that was the coward's way out," she said, tears slipping silently down her cheeks. "I convinced myself that I was being noble, but really I was just protecting myself from the pain of seeing what I had given up." She met his eyes. "When the doctors told me I was dying, I realized that all the nobility in the world wasn't worth missing the chance to know my son, even if it was only for a few months." Alejandro felt something shift inside his chest, a wall he hadn't even realized he'd built beginning to crumble. "He loves you," he said quietly. "In just a few days, he's become completely attached to you." "And I love him," Catalina replied without hesitation. "More than I ever thought possible. More than I allowed myself to feel when I signed those papers 3 years ago." "I need you to promise me something," Alejandro said, his voice carrying the weight of every fear he'd carried since becoming a father. "Anything. Promise me that when the time comes, you won't disappear without saying goodbye. I know it will be hard for him to understand, but he deserves to know. He deserves to have closure, even if he's too young to fully grasp what that means." Catalina nodded, fresh tears spilling over. "I promise. I won't do to him what my own father did to me when he left." "Your father left?" "When I was 7 and Isabella was 9. Just walked out one morning and never came back. No explanation, no goodbye, nothing." Her voice grew bitter. "I spent years wondering if I had done something wrong, if I hadn't been good enough to make him stay." Understanding flooded through Alejandro like warm water. "That's why you gave Santiago up in the first place. You were trying to make sure he wouldn't be abandoned." "Ironic, isn't it?" Catalina's laugh held no humor. "I thought I was protecting him from abandonment by abandoning him myself." As autumn deepened into winter, an unexpected routine developed in their unconventional household. Catalina would arrive each morning at 7, just as Alejandro was finishing his pre-dawn workout, and Santiago was waking up demanding breakfast and stories and attention. She would take over the morning routine with an efficiency that amazed Alejandro, getting the toddler dressed, fed, and entertained, while Alejandro showered and prepared for his day of meetings and phone calls. The transformation in both Santiago and Catalina was remarkable to witness. The little boy became more talkative, more confident, more secure in the knowledge that he was surrounded by people who loved him unconditionally. Catalina seemed to gain strength from their daily interactions, as if caring for Santiago was feeding some essential part of her soul that had been starving for years. But it was the change in Alejandro himself that surprised him most. For the first time since Santiago's birth, he wasn't carrying the full weight of parenthood alone. Catalina anticipated his needs as much as she did Santiago's, keeping track of doctor's appointments and playdates, researching preschools and activities, handling the 1,000 small details that came with raising a child. More than that, she seemed to understand the unique challenges of Alejandro's situation in ways that no one else ever had. "You don't have to pretend with me," she said one evening after Santiago had gone to bed. They were sitting in the living room, she on the couch grading flashcards she had made to help Santiago learn his colors, and Alejandro in his leather chair reviewing quarterly reports. "About who you are, I mean." Alejandro's head snapped up from his papers. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Catalina set down her flashcards and looked at him directly. "Isabella told me the truth about your arrangement. Not at first, but eventually, when she realized I wasn't going to judge either of you for it." The papers in Alejandro's hands seemed to blur. "What truth? That you're gay?" Catalina said simply. "That the marriage was a business arrangement to give you the family you wanted while protecting your privacy. That you both got exactly what you needed from the contract." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge that Alejandro wasn't sure he was ready to cross. He had spent so many years hiding, so much energy maintaining the fiction of his heterosexual life, that he didn't know how to respond to such direct honesty. "I don't expect you to confirm or deny anything," Catalina continued gently. "I just want you to know that your personal life doesn't change how I see you as Santiago's father. You love that little boy more than your own life. That's all that matters to me." Alejandro set down his papers and rubbed his eyes, suddenly exhausted by the weight of secrets he'd been carrying for so long. "How long have you known?" "Since the wedding," Catalina admitted. "There was something about the way you and Isabella interacted. Too careful, too polite. Like actors playing roles instead of a couple in love." She paused. "And then there was the way you looked at Santiago when he was born. Like he was the first real thing in your life that you'd ever been allowed to want." "He was," Alejandro said quietly. "Everything else, the company, the money, the reputation, it was all just means to an end. Santiago was the end, the point of everything." "I know," Catalina said. "I could see it from the beginning. That's part of why I agreed to Isabella's plan. I knew he would be loved, truly loved, in a way that had nothing to do with genetics or obligation. And now, knowing the truth about everything, about me, about the arrangement, do you regret your decision?" Catalina was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I regret the years I missed," she said finally. "I regret not being brave enough to ask to be part of his life sooner. But I don't regret that he ended up with you. You're exactly the father he needs." Something loosened in Alejandro's chest, a tension he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. For the first time in his adult life, someone knew all his secrets and still thought he was worthy of the role he treasured most, being Santiago's father. As winter turned to spring, their unusual family found its rhythm. Alejandro would wake to the sound of Catalina's key in the door and Santiago's delighted squeals of "Tia Cata" as he ran to greet her. She would spend the day caring for him with a devotion that went far beyond professional duty, teaching him new words and games and songs, taking him to the park when the weather was nice, reading to him for hours when it wasn't. But Alejandro began to notice the subtle changes in Catalina as well, the way she tired more easily as the months passed, the careful way she moved when she thought no one was watching, the bottles of prescription medication that appeared in her purse, their labels bearing names of drugs that Alejandro's research told him were used to manage pain and nausea in cancer patients. She was getting sicker, though she tried to hide it from both him and Santiago. "How much time?" he asked her one evening in late April after Santiago had gone to bed. She had fallen asleep on the couch while reading to him, and Alejandro had carried his son to his room alone. "The doctors aren't sure," Catalina said, but her evasive tone told him she knew more than she was saying. "How much time, Catalina?" She sighed, suddenly looking far older than her 29 years. "They think maybe until summer. July, August, if I'm lucky." 3 months, maybe 4. The knowledge hit Alejandro like a physical blow. "Is there anything that can be done? Experimental treatments, specialists I could fly in, clinical trials? I've tried everything." Catalina interrupted gently. "I've been fighting this for almost a year, Alejandro. Trust me, I've explored every option." She managed a sad smile. "I made peace with it months ago. The only thing I wanted was time with Santiago, and you've given me that. More than I ever dared hope for." "What about telling him the truth? About who you really are?" Catalina shook her head. "He's too young to understand. Genetics and biology don't mean anything to a 3-year-old. But love does. Presence does. The fact that someone cares about him and enjoys his company and makes him feel special, that's what he'll remember. And when you're gone, how do I explain that to him? The same way parents have always explained death to children," Catalina said quietly. "With love and honesty and the promise that the people we care about never really leave us, even when we can't see them anymore." As Catalina's condition worsened through the late spring, their household adapted around her needs with the instinctive grace of people who had learned to love each other, despite the impossible circumstances that had brought them together. Santiago seemed to sense that his beloved Tia Cata wasn't feeling well, and he began bringing her his favorite stuffed animals and insisting on sharing his snacks with her and curling up beside her for longer and longer afternoon naps. Alejandro found himself watching both of them with an intensity that bordered on desperation, trying to memorize every moment, every interaction, every glimpse of joy on Santiago's face and peace on Catalina's. He hired a team of private nurses to help with her care, over her protests that it wasn't necessary. "It is necessary," he told her firmly. "To me. Let me do this one thing." The nurses were discreet and professional, blending into their routine so seamlessly that Santiago barely noticed their presence. But they allowed Catalina to save her energy for the things that mattered most: reading stories, singing lullabies, teaching Santiago to braid friendship bracelets and fold origami cranes, and identify constellations through the living room windows. It was during one of those peaceful evenings in late June, as Santiago dozed in Catalina's lap while she hummed a Spanish lullaby, that Alejandro realized something that should have terrified him, but somehow didn't. He was falling in love with her. Not the desperate, consuming passion of his youth, but something deeper and more profound. He loved her courage in the face of death, her devotion to Santiago despite knowing their time was limited, her ability to find joy in the smallest moments. He loved the way she made their house feel like a home instead of just an expensive showcase. He loved her laugh, her stubbornness, her gentle teasing when he got too serious about business meetings or schedules. Most of all, he loved the way she saw him, not as a role to be played or a facade to be maintained, but as exactly who he was, a man who had built his entire life around protecting and loving his son. "I need to tell you something," he said one evening after Santiago had gone to bed, and the nurses had settled Catalina into the guest room they had converted into her space. "If it's about the experimental treatment in Switzerland, I already told you I'm not interested," Catalina said, but her tone was gentle, understanding. "It's not about treatment," Alejandro said. He took her hand, marveling at how fragile it felt in his, how the bones seemed to show through skin that had grown pale and translucent over the past weeks. "I'm in love with you." Catalina's eyes filled with tears, but she was smiling. "Oh, Alejandro." I know it's complicated. He continued quickly. I know it doesn't make sense given everything we've been through, everything you're going through. But I needed you to know. I needed you to understand that what we've built here, the three of us, it's been the most real thing in my life. I love you too, Catalina whispered. I have for months, but I was afraid to say anything because I didn't want you to think I was trying to manipulate you or take advantage of your kindness. Is that what you think this is? Kindness? I think, Catalina said carefully, that you're a man who has spent his whole life taking care of people, and I'm someone who needs taking care of. I think the situation naturally lends itself to certain feelings that might not exist under different circumstances. Alejandro leaned forward, cupping her face in his hands. Do you want to know what I think? She nodded. I think that love doesn't always follow the rules we set for it, he said. I think that finding each other, even under these circumstances, even with so little time left, is a gift. And I think that Santiago is lucky to have been loved by both of us, even if the world would say our family doesn't make sense. We are a family, aren't we? Catalina said, wonder in her voice as if she were just realizing it herself. The strangest, most unconventional family imaginable, Alejandro agreed. But yes, we're a family. They were married 3 weeks later in a quiet ceremony in the penthouse, with Santiago as their only witness and the justice of the peace whom Alejandro's lawyers had recommended. Catalina wore a simple white dress that she had ordered online, and Alejandro wore the navy suit that Santiago had declared was his favorite. The little boy served as ring-bearer, taking his job with the utmost seriousness and only dropping the rings once. The ceremony lasted 15 minutes, but the joy on Santiago's face as he watched his father kiss his beloved Tia Cata made it feel like the most important 15 minutes of Alejandro's life. Now we're really a family, Santiago announced afterward, as if the legal ceremony had somehow made official what they had all known for months. Yes, mijo, Alejandro said, lifting his son up for a hug. Now we're really a family. Catalina passed away on a Thursday morning in early August in her sleep, with the summer sun streaming through the windows of the bedroom that had become her sanctuary. Santiago had crawled into bed with her the night before, as had become his habit when he sensed she wasn't feeling well, and Alejandro found them both there in the morning, Santiago still sleeping peacefully against her side, Catalina's face serene and pain-free for the first time in months. He stood in the doorway for a long time, memorizing the sight of them together one last time, before gently waking his son and beginning the hardest conversation of his life. Tia Cata was very sick, remember? Alejandro said, as Santiago rubbed his sleepy eyes and slowly began to understand that something was different. Is she better now? Santiago asked hopefully. In a way, yes, Alejandro said carefully. Her body stopped hurting, and she's not sick anymore. But that means she had to go away, mijo. She can't stay with us anymore. Santiago looked at Catalina's still form, his 3-year-old mind struggling to process concepts that even adults found difficult to grasp. When is she coming back? She's not coming back, Santiago. But that doesn't mean she's not still with us. Do you remember how she taught you that song about the stars? Santiago nodded. She told me that the people we love become stars when they die, so they can always watch over us and make sure we're safe. So even though we can't see her or talk to her anymore, she's still loving us from far away. It would take time for Santiago to fully understand what had happened, and there would be many nights when he would ask for Tia Cata, and many tears when Alejandro had to remind him gently that she couldn't come. But children are remarkably resilient, and Santiago had been blessed with more love in his short life than many people experience in decades. Catalina had left behind a box of letters for Santiago, to be opened on birthdays and special occasions throughout his childhood and teenage years. She had also left detailed instructions for Alejandro about traditions she wanted maintained, songs she wanted Santiago to remember, and stories about their family history that she wanted passed down. But most importantly, she had left behind the silver locket that had started it all, with a note asking Alejandro to give it to Santiago when he was old enough to understand its significance. 6 months after Catalina's death, Alejandro stood in Santiago's bedroom doorway, watching his son sleep, the locket now hanging around the little boy's neck. Santiago had insisted on wearing it every day since Alejandro had explained what it meant, telling anyone who would listen that it contained a picture of him as a baby, and that it had belonged to someone who loved him very much. The grief was still there, sharp and present, but it was tempered by gratitude for the time they had been given, and for the love that had somehow bloomed in the most unlikely circumstances. Catalina had been right. Love didn't always follow the rules. Sometimes it showed up when you least expected it, in forms you never imagined, and taught you things about family and connection and what it meant to be human that no amount of money or success could ever provide. Santiago stirred in his sleep, mumbling something in Spanish that sounded like one of the lullabies Catalina used to sing to him. Alejandro stepped into the room and gently pulled the blanket up to his son's chin, pressing a soft kiss to his forehead. "Buenas noches, mijo," he whispered. "Papa!" Santiago's eyes fluttered open, still heavy with sleep. "Will you tell me the story about Tia Cata and the stars?" "Of course," Alejandro said, settling into the rocking chair beside the bed that had been Catalina's favorite spot during their evenings together. Once upon a time, there was a very special lady who loved a little boy so much that even when she had to go far away, she found a way to keep watching over him. As he told the story they had created together about love transcending death, about how the brightest stars were really people who had loved so deeply that they couldn't bear to completely leave the world behind, Alejandro reflected on how profoundly his understanding of family had changed over the past year. He had started with a contract marriage designed to give him legal protection and social acceptability. He had ended up with something infinitely more precious, the knowledge that love could exist in forms he had never imagined, that family wasn't defined by genetics or legal documents, but by the choice to show up for each other day after day, and that sometimes the most meaningful connections came from the most unexpected places. Santiago fell back to sleep, clutching his locket, and Alejandro remained in the rocking chair for a long time, watching his son's peaceful face in the dim light from the hallway. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Santiago would start preschool in the fall, and Alejandro would have to navigate single parenthood without Catalina's steady presence. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of his son's bedroom, surrounded by the lingering echoes of lullabies sung in Spanish and stories told with infinite patience, he felt the deep contentment of a man who had discovered that the best things in life often came disguised as complications. The silver locket caught a glimmer of moonlight streaming through the window, and for just a moment, Alejandro could almost hear Catalina's voice whispering the words she had said to him just days before she died. "Thank you for letting me be his mother, even if it was just for a little while. Thank you for showing me what family really means." And as he finally stood to leave Santiago's room, Alejandro whispered back to the darkness, to the stars, to wherever Catalina's spirit had gone. "Thank you for showing me that love doesn't have to make sense to be real. Thank you for giving us both the gift of knowing what it feels like to be part of something bigger than ourselves." The next morning brought sunshine and Santiago's excited chatter about the park and requests for pancakes shaped like dinosaurs. Life went on, as it always does, but it went on richer for having been touched by love that defied every convention and expectation. And sometimes, when Santiago laughed in just the right way, or hummed one of Catalina's lullabies while playing with his blocks. Alejandro caught glimpses of the woman who had taught them both that the most profound connections often come from the most unlikely beginnings. In the end, their story wasn't about biology or contracts or legal arrangements. It was about three people who found each other across impossible circumstances and chose to create something beautiful together, even knowing it couldn't last forever. It was about discovering that family is something you build rather than something you're born into, and that love, real love, transforms everyone it touches, leaving the world a little brighter even after it's gone. And every night, as Santiago drifted off to sleep with his silver locket pressed against his heart, Alejandro was reminded that some gifts are worth any price, even the pain of losing them, because loving Catalina and being loved by her in return had taught him that the human heart is capable of holding far more joy and sorrow than he had ever imagined, and that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones that end too soon, leaving behind not emptiness but gratitude for having experienced something truly extraordinary. The stars outside Santiago's window seemed to shine a little brighter that night, as if approving of the love that continued to bind their small, unconventional family together across the impossible distance between earth and sky, between memory and hope, between what was lost and what would always remain.